Have you ever heard a story so surprising that it made an entire nation stop and listen? What if I told you that a quiet research study, hidden deep inside Harvard University's archives, would one day make headlines across Australia? Music shifts slightly. Lighternation Curry. Curiosity tone. Yes, Harvard, the same university that defines the world's standards of excellence. And yet, in that single study, was one line, one sentence, that would change how millions of people saw the English language forever. Beat pause. Among all Asian nations, the most natural, the most empathetic, and the most human form of English is spoken in the Philippines. Music deepens softly. Emotional warmth enters. When this line surfaced on social media, Australians were stunned. Some laughed in disbelief. Others shrugged it off as another internet rumor. But then, something unexpected happened. Sound of typing, news clicks, chatter in background. Within days, the study reached classrooms, radio shows, and even evening news panels. And for the first time, people in Australia began to ask, could this be true? How could a small Southeast Asian nation, once colonized, once underestimated, be called the home of real English? Soft transition music, piano plus light wind chimes. But the truth was simple, because Filipino English was never just about grammar, it was about heart. Every word carried warmth, every sentence carried sincerity. And across Australian homes, hospitals and schools, people began to realize something they had always felt, that the Filipino voice carries kindness. Music swells softly. Emotional tone deepens. In call centers, in hospitals, in classrooms, they began to notice. When a Filipino spoke, the English didn't sound foreign. It sounded familiar, comforting, real. Pause, soft, emotional underscore. And that's how it began. A discovery that didn't just shake a nation, but reminded the world that the purest English is not spoken with pride, it's spoken with empathy. This story truly began with Rachel Moore, an Australian journalist living in Manila. When she read the Harvard report, she didn't see a headline. She saw confirmation that Filipinos speak not just with clarity, but with heart. Rachel pitched her editor. Let's find out why millions of Filipinos speak English in a way that touches people. From that day, her journey began, from call centers in Makati to classrooms in Iloilo, searching for what Harvard called authentic. In a call center, she met Ella, who said, "Amay, now, when we talk to Australians, we don't just follow scripts, we listen to their feelings. Maybe that's why we sound more human." That sentence changed Rachel's life. Filipino English, she realized, wasn't about grammar. It was about empathy. Rachel traveled across the Philippines, listening, observing, learning. She met Mr. Santos, a teacher who told his students, when you speak English, make sure your words carry respect. That's more important than accent. Everywhere she went, Rachel heard warmth. Not perfection, but sincerity. Filipinos said, take care, and meant it. They said, I'm okay, not to dismiss, but to comfort. She began to realize, Filipino English isn't learned in school, it's lived every day. Even her own speech changed. She spoke slower, softer, kinder. She finally understood, the Filipino language of English is the language of grace. Rachel's article went viral. Within 24 hours, it hit 1 million views in Australia. Within weeks, 10 million. Filipinos around the world wept with pride. Teachers read it in classrooms. Nurses printed it on hospital walls. Workers abroad shared it with their employers, saying, "This is us." Even Harvard took notice again, releasing a new statement. The Filipino use of English exemplifies empathy, a blend of clarity and compassion that bridges cultures. It was no longer about language, it was about dignity, about a nation realizing that their voice had always been beautiful. Rachel returned to the Philippines to see what her story had inspired. She found peace, confidence, and pride everywhere. Children said, "We speak English from our heart," and Harvard itself declared, "Language is not grammar, it is empathy." Before flying home, Rachel wrote her final piece, "The Language of the Heart." She ended it with these words. The Filipino way of speaking English isn't about accent or grammar, it's empathy carried through sound. The way a nurse says, "Are you okay?" and makes you believe it. The way a teacher says, "Try again," and gives you courage. and as she flew home, she whispered softly, "The world has many languages, but only a few are spoken with love, and the Philippines, you speak it best." Time passed, but Rachel's story never faded. What began as one article, written in a quiet Manila cafe, soon became a movement that circled the globe. Sound of paper turning, soft typing sound. In classrooms from Sydney to Singapore, her words were now read aloud. Filipino English is not just spoken, it's felt. Teachers began using it as an example, not of grammar, but of grace. In Canada, Filipino nurses comforted patients with voices that felt like family. And in London, one English professor smiled and said, "We study rules, but they speak from the soul." Slowly, the laughter that once echoed across Australia was replaced by respect, a quiet, humble admiration for a language born of kindness. Rachel would often receive emails, letters from people she had never met. One said, "I used to hide my accent, now I speak proudly, because someone finally said our English is beautiful." And every time she read such words, Rachel would close her eyes and whisper to herself, maybe this was never just a story. Maybe this was a reminder that words can heal. Background sound, ocean waves, symbolizing global reach. Her story had become an echo, spreading from the islands of the Philippines to every corner of the world where a Filipino voice was heard. In airports, in hospitals, in classrooms, you could hear it. A tone of patience, a sound of care. It was the echo of empathy. And the world was finally listening. It was a quiet morning in Sydney. The sunlight touched Rachel's desk where a pile of letters had been waiting, messages from readers around the world. But one envelope stood out, old-fashioned, handwritten, with words on the front that said, "From Mr. Santos, Iloilo, Philippines." Rachel smiled. She remembered him instantly, the kind teacher who had told his students, "Respect first, accent later." Soft page-turning sound. She carefully opened the letter. The handwriting was neat, the paper slightly wrinkled. And as she began to read, her eyes softened, because these were not just words, they were gratitude. Mr. Santos had written, "Dear Rachel, you may not remember me, but I will never forget you. After your article went viral, everything changed in my classroom. My students, once shy and unsure, now speak with pride. They no longer fear their accent. They see it as a badge of warmth, a sign that they belong to a people who speak with kindness." Soft music intensifies slightly, emotional tone builds. Rachel paused, her voice trembling as she whispered the next lines. "You reminded us that our English is not broken, it is human, and that is something no book can teach." She put the letter down, and tears filled her eyes. In that moment she realized, what she wrote months ago was no longer just journalism. It had become something much greater, a mirror where millions of Filipinos could finally see their worth. Rachel stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the rising sun. For a long moment, she simply whispered, This is why stories matter." Pause. Sound of a gentle wind, symbolizing inspiration. That letter stayed on her desk for years, folded, slightly faded, but forever alive. Because it wasn't just paper, it was proof that when words are written with truth, they don't just inform, they transform. Years passed, but Rachel's story continued to travel, from one generation to the next, from one classroom to another. Then one day, a message arrived from the Philippines once again, an invitation. The University of Manila wanted to honor her for her contribution to cultural understanding and global empathy. Rachel hesitated at first. She had grown older now, her hair a little grayer, her pace a little slower, but her heart still carried that same fire. So she boarded a plane back to the country where it all began. Soft airplane ambience, fading into city sounds, Manila streets, gentle chatter. As she arrived, students welcomed her with flowers, teachers smiled with gratitude, and the crowd chanted softly, "Samandan Shundraban now. Shasistalbert Aperi. Right cheap, ow, ow." She walked onto the stage standing before hundreds of young Filipinos, their eyes bright with hope, and then she spoke. "When I first came to the Philippines, I thought I was here to study how you speak English. But what I found was something far deeper. You taught me that the beauty of language is not in its rules, but in its heart. Music swells softly, emotional. Her voice trembled, but her words were crystal clear. The world has many accents, but only a few can comfort the soul. Your English, your Filipino English, is not about sounding perfect. It's about sounding human. The audience fell silent. Some smiled, some wiped their tears. Rachel continued, when a Filipino nurse says, "Are you okay?" you feel safe. When a teacher says, "You can do it," you believe it. And when a child says, "Thank you," you know they mean it. Soft applause builds in background. So never let anyone tell you that your English is less, because your voice carries empathy, and empathy is the greatest language of all. The hall erupted in applause. People stood, clapping, cheering, crying. Rachel smiled through her tears. As the lights dimmed, a giant screen behind her glowed with these words, Filipino English, the language of the heart. Rachel looked up, her eyes reflecting the golden light. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "You don't need perfect grammar to touch the world. You only need sincerity in your voice." Music rises, soft strings, piano, emotional crescendo. And as the camera panned across the crowd, students, teachers, nurses, workers, each one speaking, smiling, laughing, the narrator's final words echoed, because sometimes the world doesn't need another language, it just needs a voice that feels like home. Music fades out slowly, sound of ocean waves and distant laughter. Screen fades to black. Text on screen, dedicated to every Filipino voice that speaks with kindness.